the beginning.
Got it. I'm in.
And there we go. And I'm going to mute. So you're up.
Okie doke. Right. Okay then. Oh. So, okay, this is the second part of the history of London's Royal Naval Reserve. Just to recap some of the things from the first point, what we'd really talked about in the first year was everything from, well, actually from about 1600 up to the end of the First World War. And that's kind of where we're going to pick up from now. But just to go over it, we talked about, I mentioned the fact that the R&R was established as in its current form in 1903. HMS Gannet, which was an old sailing ship, was opened at in London in I'm just going the dock in East London for use as an administration. In 1904, HMS Buzzard came alongside, and that was the first training ship that the R&R in London had. 1905, by that time they'd started to organise exercises, and they spent time at sea on warships. As you may remember, I mentioned that actually the Admiralty didn't pay an awful lot of money or make much of a contribution to the R&R. And in 1908, it conceded that it needed to put more money and invest more money, and it did so, and it started to increase the amount of kit it provided, paid some retainers to members of the ship's company, and so on. Churchill's promise was a bit of a heartbreak. I remember, if you remember, I said that in 1913 there was much chagrin about the R&R, RMVR, what was going to happen with the First World War. Everyone expected it was coming, and Churchill promised that that all the reservists would spend their times at sea, and that of course didn't happen. If you may recall, in 1914 that they created the Royal Naval Division, and with the exception of a few technical ratings, mostly communicators, because that was relatively new in those days, everyone basically became a land-based army. And it was the most decorated army that Britain offered, or the most decorated division, and it served in more theatres of war than even the army. So the R&R made a major contribution. So we're back to up to date now. Okay, 1919. These photographs are Horse Guards Parade, and in 1919 was when the dispersal of the Royal Naval Division. Everyone had come home, but it's not strictly true actually, because there was still a lot of people. My grandfather was still in Palestine, the Middle East, in 1920. It didn't come home till much after that, but it was a little while before the R&R or the RMVR really returned to some sort of form of training. It says there 1921. I will say there's a couple of videos as well, probably more than a couple. Hopefully you'll find them interesting. So after the First World War, the Navy had shrunk significantly, as it did after the Second. There was no need for such a large Navy. The branches of the Royal Naval Reserve or Volunteer Reserve changed significantly, and they were becoming far more in tune with technical innovations in the military. I've been doing some reading. It doesn't seem that much longer before the First World War that many of the ships that we produced up to Dreadnought anyway still had sails. You know, there was steam, coal-fired steam, and sails. So promotion, it was far more regulated. Yeah, so there were far more opportunities for ratings to be advanced through structured training programs, and also through the way that billets were created within these units. A new ship, because Buzzard had just about had it, all right, to be perfectly honest. A new ship was appointed to a London division. It was called Marjoram, and it was an class sloop, but it didn't actually make it to London. It was brought out under tow from Queenstown in Ireland in 1921 in January. It had no engines on board. It wasn't under its own steam. It was towed by a tug. The seas were particularly rough, and as you can see from that the hawser parted. The ship went towards the rocks. So they tied another hawser. Later on, that parted as well. It headed towards the rocks, and it broke up. And they reckon that within 24 hours, it was just bits of metal and bits of wood. The weather was really bad. There was one petty officer and 5 ratings on board, and they were all saved. So there was no loss of life in this. but it did cause a big administrative problem. They had to find a replacement. Okay, and these two photos here are the replacement. It's HMS President, or Saxifrage, as it was its original name. Any ship that came up to London, or any vessel, any there was only 2 or 3, I guess, or 2 after this one. When it moved to the building, they retained the name, renamed the name President. The interesting thing about this vessel is that it was actually within the square mile of London, the city of London, and so with that, it accorded, certain privileges. So, actually, London's Pride was its original name, nicknamed the Herbaceous Border. So she came out, and she was then reallocated. And 6 months from the sinking of the Marjoram, then there was this new ship, HMS President, arriving at King's Reach. If you look at the left-hand side, she was commissioned before the end of the First World War, but didn't see any action. But you can see her in dazzle paint, which was how she was fitted up before she arrived. They did make some changes to her, and there's a little video clip, lasts about 30 seconds. I'll show you in a second. What they did was they took the superstructure down and they converted it, basically put like a big shed on the upper deck, and they used that as a drill hall. And so they made lots of modifications to it to make it more suitable for training. So here we have, this is the old ship, HMS Buzzard, the one that was there from 1903, being moved out. It's a silent film. It's just fascinating. Being in London, of course, you get to, you're in everyone's focus. People see it. So there isn't much that goes on that doesn't get recorded. And I do recall that in my research, the amount of times that old admirals that were going up and down the river on their boats would send a signal or complain or something to President because the paint wasn't right or something else was looking pretty shoddy. It still used to happen in my time. This is the new one coming along now. This is the new president. This is the president, Laurie, that your Matt went on board when he came and paid us a visit in London. So there you go. And so this is the new ship, the ship that stayed there till the mid-90s. Obviously, it left dock a few times to be refitted. No bottom scrapes and stuff. But if you look at that as it goes through, you'll see that the superstructure has been removed. Nothing like the wartime dazzle paint job. And in a minute, and it really is that tight, to be fair. You'll see that's the old shed that was replaced on. That was common practice when they used to use old sailing ships as training ships. They would do that because it protected the timber work underneath. And so there she is coming on. That's the first time she came up. I think 1922, was it 21, 22, 21. There you go. So it's only a minute or so. A couple of videos are silent, but so there you go. That's that. Right. Okay. Being in London, of course, this is true up until today. I mean, if ever you watch any on your TVs, anything going on in London with any military events, and there are sailors lining the streets, there's a pretty strong chance it'll be lads and lasses from HMS President. But these King's colours were presented because each battalion, I think there were 6 battalions. President was presented with the colours of Drake Battalion, and if you ever visit President, get a chance to go there. Drake's drum, that's the divisional drum, and the colours are still in the drill hall now. Okay, as well as a replica of Tisdall's Victoria Cross, which we spoke about in the previous presentation. Okay, 1930s. Strict, basically back to peacetime running, all training, boat pulling on the river. They just sailing at long reach. You don't do any sailing at long reach now. They use ribs. Bisley is an international shooting competition, and often you'll find American servicemen there, Canadian or NATO servicemen taking part in these competitions, and the R&I were no different. They used to take part as well. Now, another thing that changed was what sailors had to do to qualify as what they call efficient volunteers. This hasn't changed much either. The difference now is, or it was up until I left, that a sailor had to complete 28 days, what they call operational role training. So, and I was talking to you about going to Canada earlier and taking a group out there for a couple of weeks. That wouldn't have counted. That's what they call adventurous training. So operational training meant that sailors had to be either doing their job or training for their job. But also what happened in the 30s, there were a lot more trips. So they were starting to take it a little bit more seriously. I don't mean the sailors, I mean that the Navy was taking the organization more seriously. And they worked out that if you want to engage, if you want to train these lads, well, it was lads then, there wasn't any females in it. If you want to train these lads, then they're going to have to do it at sea and work on the guns and work within in a regular naval environment. And so it was in 1938 when there was the Spanish Civil War. Some of our lads were on minesweeper, were on trawlers, working out motor trawlers out in the Bay of Biscay, and they were retained. In fact, they mobilised other lads that were WT, that were communicators, and they also were sent out there. A couple of photographs from the time. The top left-hand side is a sketch of President itself. There's just a greeting card from the unit. I want to really bring your attention to the one on the right, which is the wardroom HMS President. Now that's the old ship. All that furniture and all those trophies that you see there were all shipped over to the new one. In fact, the Navy has something's called the Trophy Centre in London, RNTs in Portsmouth, where whenever a ship decommissions, all the trophies get sent there until that ship's name gets reused, and they all come back out again. I tell you that because all the furniture in there, I believe most of that furniture, the tables and chairs, originated from ships that served at the Battle of Jutland. So once again, your map saw those, walked in and saw that it was in that wardroom. 1937, again, war's looming again at this time, and so there's more emphasis on recruiting. Again, HMS President there, as it was now, you'll see people will come on board, ignoring the photograph on the right just for a second. They will come on board just like any other Naval Reserve unit. Even today, you'd meet the people, you'd have a tour of the unit, you'll be looking at, they'll be doing some drills, they might be doing some seamanship. We used to take people up and down the river on the ribs. All these sort of activities took place just so to encourage people to come and join us. In fact, there's a video at the end of this presentation, which is a modern day equivalent. I'm going to talk a little bit about it in a minute, but one of the things that the Admiralty decided leading up to the Second World War, that they need to reconfigure the reserves, and so they started to form anti-aircraft crews ready for placement on AA cruisers. And there's a photograph there on the right-hand side of an RMVR crew, a President crew that was at sea practicing on a C-class cruiser just prior to the Second World War. And interestingly enough, I managed to find this little clip of that particular day, that Navy Day weekend. Yeah, so HMS President, pretty well in that format, hadn't changed an enormous amount up until then. And after the Second World War, all the armaments were taken off, and so it kind of reverts back to its training role. But in 1938, being aware of the need to increase the capacity, because President not only became a training pass for reserves, it became a recruiting centre and a training centre. There was also medical teams on board, because we were just one step away from drafting people into the service. So she was joined by a sister ship then, again another Flower class corvette, or ex-Flower class corvette, called HMS Chrysanthemum. Although, as you can see from that cartoon from a newspaper of the time, there was everyone said that everyone called it Tulip because they claimed that no one could spell chrysanthemum, but that's not strictly true. But it ended up with that nickname, and it was called Tulip for quite some while. So, excuse me. Here is, and just to say, there's a couple of these little clips. This is another one. This is Chrysanthemum coming alongside. again, hard to believe that something like that happens along the River Thames would make any difference whatsoever these days. But you know, in them days, this was all big news, and so therefore the second one up alongside, slightly different format. They both stayed in that position. As you can see, she's already fitted with some guns. They both stayed in that location right up until 1990. So, okay. One of the things that they were short of in the regular Navy, it happens, I think, quite frequently. They reevaluate what the reserves do, what they want from the reserves, and at that stage they realised that there was a shortage of WT or wireless telegraphy ratings, and so Chrysanthemum was brought up specifically for that purpose and fitted with all the different, as it was, the most modern radio equipment. Okay, they both were fitted with the AA guns, and selected members of the seamanship branch were detailed off to become. And what happened in essence was different gun crews were formed. So these gun crews would work together, they get to know each other. That there were anti-aircraft guns fitted on the ships, and so they would work and train regularly as a team to become efficient in what they did. So when they got moved onto a warship, they were ready. The ships they were being prepared for were the C class, okay. And there is a book, actually, I've got a copy of it here, written in the 50s, called The Valiant Quartet, and it goes into some detail of the 4 ships that the lads that served on. What was really interesting was that these guns were obviously trained outboard, not facing the embankment, and regularly there'll be aircraft, what we used to call the RAF, or the Fleet Air Arm, called string bags, which was the old fairy swordfish or Spitfires or something, would come along towing targets so they could train their guns, and this was a frequent occurrence. So even though I think that there was this myth that we kind of like wandered blindly into the Second World War, I do think that we were undermanned, there's no denying that, but I also feel that Chamberlain bought an enormous amount of time. There's a lot of preparation, a lot of work going on in the background that wasn't really that well advertised. Now that little chart, if you can see it, is the actual deployment on October the 20th. That's where everybody went. So according to that chart, there was 2,500 ratings. Now I have to express they weren't all reservists. They weren't all RNVR. Some would have been RN, ex-RN retired. Some would have been Merchant Navy retired, and they would all and retired, I should say. And that gives the deployment. So if you look at that, 655 sailors of different branches. So the first branch, there was seamanship, then you've got the consignors, then you've got the telegraphists, and then you've got the supply branch and a few artificers at the end. But of that lot, 655 went straight to Chatham, and they'd have been mobilized, they'd have been through their medicals, they'd have had pre-deployment checks done and some training done, and off they went. And that gives you exactly where every sailor went. I photocopied this from the mess. When I was a mess president, there's a visitor's book there, and in this visitor's book, I'm sure you can read it yourself, but it says when war against Germany on September 3rd was declared, the following members of the mess were, I can't quite read that. Okay, in HMS President, or resident in HMS President and Chrysanthemum, and so the mess president, who was the Chief Ingram, listed that the R&Rs that were there, ready to be mobilised on the 3rd of September 1939. Nice bit of history. We've also got a few royal signatures in that book as well. But so, okay, HMS President, and these are the ships that they served on, and there were 4: Curlew, Calcutta, Cairo, and Coventry. Sadly, they didn't have a very happy war. Not one of them survived, and some of our lads lost their lives. But then I guess that was probably common in every area of conflict. Calcutta. All right, so just go through the 4 ships as they were. She saw action on the 21st, and she was waves of hindcourse. And I'm sure the lads from President had an enormous amount of work to do, because that was their role. In 1940, Operation Dynamo Dunkirk. The first return of the Thames, she brought back over 600 soldiers. The following day, returned with 1,000. However, she also had an accident on the 25th of June. she, in bad weather, she collided with Fraser, the Canadian ship Fraser, cut her in half. 45 lads, Canadian lads, and 13 of our lads lost their lives in that accident. I did read the report actually some time ago, and I just can't remember who it was. So I do know that the weather was poor. Somebody turned who shouldn't have turned, and I actually think it was the Calcutta that moved and collided with the Fraser. So, okay, she sunk by waves of Junkers in 1941. I think much is said, and you're going to see this once we go through this, because most of these C-class cruisers are in the Med. Much is said about the Atlantic convoys. Okay, much is said about the Russian convoys, and quite rightly so. But not so much is mentioned about the Mediterranean convoys, which were treacherous in the respect that the weather was always relatively good, and that for large chunks of their time in the Med, they were, exposed to aircraft, and as some chap told me, it was like a roller coaster going through it. Here's some photographs. Calcutta there she is, top left, bottom right. The photo at the bottom left is was taken at Dunkirk from HMS Calcutta. Not a great photograph, I'll give you that, but it was contemporary. The chap on the top right, and I haven't got his name, was one of the survivors from the Fraser, and I thought that would probably be appropriate to include his photograph in that also. Cairo is another one, like Cruiser. Okay, launched 1918. These are not old, new ships, you can guess. These were just post First World War ships. Norwegian fjords, again, very tight note, very risky. Not much maneuverability. A lot of convoy work. I've seen the CO's report, and it is available, but there's a little bit of a summary here. If you want to have a look through that, I'll give you a second to, if you wish to. It must have been incredibly frightening, because you just sat there with wave after wave. I'll mention Operation Pedestal in a moment. And again, the chap I was talking to there, she said it was relentless during the daytime. It was just aircraft after aircraft, and the amount of losses in the convoys, the Malta convoys, was huge. Okay, I'm going to move on. Again, these are some photographs. This is from the ship when she was in Norway. On the two, one on the right when she was a bit further up the ice, while they're under a camp. I think you can see in the background, the top left-hand side, there's some smoke kicking off. It was a very difficult time because, as you may or may not know, we landed troops to try and help the Norwegians fight off the Germans, but unfortunately, they were overwhelmed. Royal Marines, I think it was, that went in. HMS Cairo, another one. Okay, mortar convoy left Gibraltar. 6 merchant vessels. Okay, takes 4 of the supply ships and destroyer were sunk. So of the 6 already, 4 days into the convoy, and it's lost 2 supply ships. I know the Bedouin went as well, but already, and that just goes to show how dangerous these were. And then, one of the problems that I mentioned is no fuel oil. The Malta convoys, the Germans were trying to starve Malta of fuel and food. In fact, for a long period of time, on Malta itself, there was only ever 3 aircraft: Faith, Hope, and Charity, 3 Spitfires. Okay, until these convoys started to break through and fly aircraft off to support them. But fuel oil was becoming desperately short. This is the one that's most spoken about, where there was significant losses, and a ship that was loaned to Britain from America, the SS Ohio, managed. And I really encourage you to read the book if you do. It's incredible what hammering that vessel took, and it still stayed afloat. And there's a little clip in a minute that will show you that. So HMS Eagle sunk not far out of Gibraltar. Okay, so that was 4 aircraft saved. When she was sunk, the idea really was that it wasn't to take the aircraft carriers to Malta, the idea was to get the aircraft carriers as close to Malta as they could, so the Spitfires could fly off. Then they would come back. Now, unfortunately, Eagle sunk so close to Jib that they couldn't get all the aircraft. Of 4 were saved. They went on to another aircraft carrier. There was 3 aircraft carriers that went. One of the submarines were hit by it, 40 German bombers, no damage to the convoy. Okay, so this is like, I keep saying it's relentless. Okay, right. So Furious managed to get her Spitfires off, and then they get to Malta, which supports the 3 that were remaining. Okay, Luftwaffe attacks, and this is relentless and continuous. Yeah. 60. So there's a huge barrage. I'm going to show you the video in a moment, which I guess hopefully will do it justice. Victorious was hit. And then Azdic, which was the old name for sonar, found an Italian submarine and sunk it. Yeah. Okay. Well, before they tried to retrieve stuff for it. Okay. So ramming a ship, as my buddy worked out when he was in the Cod Wars, is okay at the moment, but then you put your ship out of action and you often have to make your way home. Again, I know these are like just paragraphs that come up, little paragraphs, and it's very difficult, I think. But as I've said this once already, that I remember speaking to this veteran who was on pedestal some years ago, and he said to me that if you imagine one of those at a fun fair where you get the I don't know what you call it, that goes round, as it goes round, the chairs move out. He said that's exactly what it felt like. He said as soon as one wave of fighters or bombers had come across, there was another one and another one. Yeah, Indom under attack. Okay. Again, fired and hit, with Victorious being the only carrier left. Now, Ohio had been hit several times by now. Yeah. And there was a huge attack on there. And I think it put its steering out. Ships were trying to, British warships were going alongside. They couldn't get, and they were trying to keep it up from sinking. Eventually, as it got nearer, it was taken over by tugs. Cairo was hit, sunk, an abandoned ship. Now I'm going to show this little clip, which is a colorized. It comes from what I think is an American documentary, but it's a colorized version of Operation Pedestal. Okay, there's just a summary there, the losses. Okay, TC there, and that's a black and white still of the Ohio. You can see there's not much freeboard as she's coming into the harbour. I mean, fortunately, the weather, well, it's the good weather that created a lot of the problems, yeah. But I mean, fortunately for her, the good weather stopped her, helped her stay afloat. The chap on the bottom left-hand corner is typical of one of the Dems gunners that would have been on the Ohio and also in the other merchant ships. He was my uncle. He was a what they call a gunner on a defensively equipped merchant ship and Royal Artillery, and they got posted on these ships. Not R&R, not President, but I just thought I'd throw that in. Okay, last one now. Curlew, famous for shortest war, 1940. These accidents happened, all right. This accident where a pom-pom gun went off. I mean, down in the Falklands, when I was there, 1982, there was 2 lads got killed cleaning a gun in the Falkland Islands. They just didn't do their checks, and suddenly, but it happens. Yeah, it's not an exercise when it's real. And then she lost her run aground. There's sinking 2 hours later. Again, not much room in Norway in the fjords. Very difficult, I would imagine, especially if you're under attack. The little picture on the left-hand side is one of the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve anti-aircraft guns and crews on the Curlew. Oh, not the second, not sorry. Coventry, 93 attacked by 15 Stukas. Okay. 2 from our division were killed. There was 1 Victoria Cross awarded to a petty officer, and that petty officer was, while seriously wounded, stayed at his post and continued to support. And he was gazetted, and that in italics is the report that came out, as it says there in the London Gazette after his death. Right, just to briefly now, just to say that these are some of the other ships that our lads, obviously there were survivors from these ships, and they were deployed as they were needed. And their names of those people, there are many more than this. These were just a few. I mean, but there are a few of these people here, different ships, different where they served, and you can see some on the Ark Royal Oak, which had a short-lived life. We got an HMS Harrier. So there's various ships there that the sailors went on to from their Sea Club cruisers. And I think before we just about come to the end of the element of the Second World War, that's our contribution, if you like, in lives. Those are the names of the sailors that lost their lives from HMS President, from my unit during the Second World War. Peacetime, as you can imagine, people weren't very keen. They were tired of war. Who isn't? Yeah. So people weren't very keen to come back, but eventually they did. Yeah. As it says there, many people stayed in the Navy where they could. It was, I guess, it becomes a part of your life. Well, I know it does, doesn't it, for a while. Recruiting 1947, trickle recruiting, not huge, yeah. Okay, it was just to get a few in. Some of the pre-war ratings, obviously the most experienced came back, and they basically took over. They led the division forward. A lot of the weaponry came off, and the way that the training, the ships both went down to Chatham for refits to be totally reconfigured. Well, not totally, to reverse back to their pre-war configuration, makes them more suitable for peacetime training. And they started to get ships that they could hone their seamanship skills on. The picture at the bottom is an example of one of the tenders that that President had. That particular one still afloat, and it runs out of Portsmouth Dockyard. It's part of the museum in Portsmouth. That picture there is one of the best ones that I could find to show you what she looks like out of it. You might just at this end here, it's the tail end of the stern of HMS Chrysanthemum. This is President. This little boat here is the Oliver Twist, which was what they used to use for training. And my office, that scuttle there, was where I used to live. Okay, sweepers. I don't have time. Minesweepers. We moved on. 1950s, they started to get minesweeping. It was a role that was really busy, as you can imagine, at the end of the war, and they were deployed to take those minesweeping duties. I mean, they still find mines now. they find mines, they find bombs. There was one found in Plymouth 2 months ago. As you can imagine, some part, they build over and dig over and they churn themselves up. So 1951, females joined. It became the Royal Naval Volunteer, Women's Royal Naval Volunteer, the Wrens, they joined. And then they upgraded the minesweepers to more modern ships, more coastal ships. I mean, they are still sweeping mines now. I know when I was in Estonia, they were talking there about the mines and the bombs and the ordnance they were finding in the straits, just not far from their main dockyard. Other things that are quite significant, we got the Horse Guards Parade in 1954. We got, again, the Queen's coronation in 1953. The ship in the middle was Scots ship Discovery. She became a part of our unit, and before my time, apparently she was used as a training ship. There was classrooms on there, I guess, or whatever. When I was at President, she was a tender to me, so I looked after her account. But it was never. It was more for VIPs and stuff like that. It was never really used as a training base. In fact, the only time I ever really got involved with it was when she was sailing up to Scotland to be moved to a museum up there, and the chief stoker discovered that all the firefighting gear that he'd signed for was sailing up the Thames with it. So, but apart from that, it was very, very simple. That was there for, again, since 55. The RN then formed something called the MCM-10, which is they became minesweeper squadrons. So they would work as a team. So these 13 or 14 reserve units around the country would all start to go on deployments, and eventually, of course, go on deployment with NATO. 1948, they did away with the RNVR, merged it, so everyone became a Royal Naval Reserve. That's insignificant in this presentation, I guess, but in terms of how the RNR was structured, was quite a big move. And there's a couple of examples of the ton class minesweepers that we used. Wooden hulls, aluminium and wooden hulls. They were actually quite good ships. The 60s. Okay, lots of activities there, foreign trips, working with NATO, deployed with NATO, and of course, again, going back to the ceremonials that took place, it was Winston Churchill's funeral. And there's a photograph, that's HMS, that's Chrysanthemum forward, and that's the, that's HMS President. And this is Churchill's funeral, floats going up the river. There's actually quite a lot of controversy at the time. Although he was a popular wartime leader, he wasn't a particularly popular peacetime leader. And there's much said about the cranes along the river by the docks were all dipped. Well, they weren't going to do it. They had to convince the dockers to do it. They're all going to go on strike and not. But I think they were convinced that he did more good than he did harm. As I say, he wasn't a very popular peacetime leader, but as a wartime leader, I think he was, as they say, right man, right time, right job. This is quite sad. Another thing that's in the 70s now, HMS Fiddleton, manned mostly by HMS President, had a collision. I mean, this story is this presentation really is kind of a pockmarked history of President and the significant dates, if you like, that had an impact on those people. It was hard for someone like me who didn't work in the seamanship world to understand the impact of how people worked in their crews on these minesweepers. I did go to sea on some, but they called them. They went into different watches, and this particular watch was in a RAS, not a RAS. It was a light jackstay transfer with HMS Mermaid. I've got a video, but I've decided not to show it. But a light jackstay transfer with HMS Mermaid. Now, there's a lot of, I've said what went wrong, what didn't go wrong, but what cannot be denied is that Mermaid was bigger than Fiddleton, which is the minesweeper, and they were stuck together. I think Fiddleton tried to accelerate out of it, couldn't, and then basically it hit the Mermaid and rolled upside down. I'm not going to go into the details. You don't need to know it. If you want to read about it, there's plenty about it in the paper. It just, but there's some photographs. She was upside down for quite a while, and then she sank. These photos at the top here are where these two here when she was recovered. I actually did go on board the Fiddleton. I was in the regular Navy at the time in September '76, and she was brought into Chatham and I did go on board for a very, very brief while during the investigation. But yes, what you see there is what you got. She moved from that to the other one. This panel is in HMS President now. It's King's Reach. Sorry, it's St Catherine's Dock. We've got a new building, which I'll talk about in a bit. And that stain window is there. And every September, any of the old lads any old lads that are left, they have a ceremony here. And they also, that Fiddleton is named after a small village in Leicestershire, and they go to the village church where they're all remembered as well. In the 70s, okay, lots of change going on. There's a bloke on the right hand side there. His name is Al Simpson. He's still, I think he works at, well, he used to work at a museum in Halifax. I think it was Halifax. There's a Flower class Corvette, and he used to be one of the volunteers on there. And then we had the celebration of 75th birthday. Yeah, so there was a lot of it. We've had American officers come on board. When we say an exchange, it's not like when you're in the regular Navy where 2 officers would change or 2 ratings would change as they do now. It was more that if, as reservists, if they were working in the City of London or working in the UK, they would request to do their training with us, and that was never a major problem. In the 80s, the biggest thing that happened to London Division in the 80s was me. All right, that's when I joined. All right, okay, and that's when it really started to go downhill. Okay, we took part in exercises, big NATO exercises. Greater focus became more embedded into the regular Navy. The branches became more aligned. There was a much bigger expansion, deployed on operational missions. There were real jobs where you were totally responsible. I mean, I worked during my time in the 90s out in the Middle East on massive exercises, worked with American Navy and all sorts, which was unheard of up until that period. In 1999, they started to reorganize again. Yeah, updated. There were some major changes, which we're going to talk about in the 90s. It was basically the end of the ton class. The ton class was decided it would go. In fact, the minesweeper, it was almost coming to an end, the life of a minesweeper. Anyway, if you think about it, it's inherently dangerous to sail over a mine and then try and destroy it, isn't it? So we kind of morphed away from that into mine hunters, but they were really the domain of the regular Navy. But what they did give the reserves were these very new, very modern minesweepers, river class, and they were terrific ships. I went on a couple of short trips with my logistics hat on to do some work on board, and they were absolutely superb. Very modern accommodation, pretty good seakeeping qualities and so on. The headquarters moved in the 80s, back end of the 80s. It moved from there to a place called St Catherine's Dock. Some of you may have known about it. It's right next door to London Bridge. It's quite famous in its own right. And we were all quite happy because there was a Starbucks nearby. So Sandy Woodward, who was the commander in the carrier battle force group during the Falklands, did the opening, so it was quite prestigious. We get a lot of people that come and visit. You'll see some photos in a minute. One thing that was significant, at the bottom of the slide, you'll see 2 crests. On the right-hand side was the old London crest. Now, you might not be aware of that, but that is the badge. The cross of St George with the dagger is the emblem of the City of London. Well, the unit moved out of the City of London, and so therefore adopted the Greater London crest, which is the anchor in front of the Tower of London. And that's what the unit looks like now, although there is a banner. Nowhere near as much fun, very practical, very functional, and it's just by Tower Bridge. If we was looking at it from across the river, turning left, there'll be the Tower Hotel, and then Tower Bridge, and then the Tower of London. So it really is, we get quite a lot of touristy people. 90s, Thornycroft Trophy. They have competitions, and they were very successful when their minesweeping capacities. We had a lot of visitors. Bottom left-hand corner is Princess Anne. We used to get a lot of, Prince Michael of Kent. It's a regular churn that we would get VIPs who were doing something in London, because President really was the Navy's presence in London. The right-hand side, we used to take part in the Lord Mayor's show. He used to take his carriage past, and we'd give him a tot. And that was quite, again, one of our ceremonies that we used to get involved with. I often think that, as the only presence in London, that I wonder who they would do it, who they would get to do it if we weren't there. So One thing I'll show, very brief film, is that every year they have a parade, a very short parade. In it, one evening, it takes place inside the Tower of London. And here's an example of one of those. It's a very short clip. Everyone marches out the main gate. Alongside, you can see how close we are. That's Tower Bridge in the background. There's some old faces there that I recognise. That's the Tower Courtyard. And they have presentations. It's the big annual, we call it the annual divisions. It's a part of the R&R's commitment. So it's not a, you must be there. It's not optional. As I told you, I did say it would be a very short video. And then we go on to this, we're coming towards the end now, at least of the 2000s. All right, D-Day landings. This photo at the right-hand side, we took part in the D-Day landings. That's not in the D-Day landings, but in the commemoration. That's HMS Belfast, in the Port of London, and the R&Rs were the gun crew that fired these dummy rounds and apparently vibrated quite a few windows in the city. SDR, more options for change. From my point of view, they introduced what they call the logistics branch, which changed things significantly. And we got involved a lot more with what they call joint maritime courses. Every year, and they still hold them now, they're called Joint Warrior. All NATO, including American Navy, Canadians, European sailors, they have this exercise. It starts on the on the east coast of Scotland, and they sail right around to the west coast where they do an amphibious landing. There's a photograph down there of HMS Fearless that shows that. And what we used to do, we used to manage the logistics for all those ships. So anything that came in, from the States perhaps, that would come into airports, we would see that it got to the ships as well as we would our own. We had so we had a genuinely real job to do that. If we weren't doing it, would take people away from the fleet. Middle East deployments, that was really useful, actually, these deployments. It was a Middle East deployments that identified that our tanks didn't have the suitable air filters for the engines. And as a result of Safe Syria 1 and 2, they were modified, which was fortunate, of course, for later to happen a few years later. And adventurous training. So all these things happened. Where did we go? Well, this is in the 2000s. Operation Veritas and Operation Telic. Veritas is Afghanistan. Telic is Iraq. And I'll just run you through the pictures. This is me when I was out the Gulf. This is one of the jobs. This is HMS Scott, one of the ships we had to support. This picture here is an old buddy of mine. He was out in Kuwait at the time. He was doing his bit there. Bottom left-hand side, that group photograph, that's the medical, that's our medical, mobile medical team, all reservists. They all were reservists, yeah. That's just vehicles going to Basra, I think. This one here on the bottom right-hand side is American AWACS, because we worked very, very close when we were out there. From a logistics point of view, I certainly did. We were often supporting each other. And now we're coming towards the end. Okay, presentation of the Sovereign's colour, Horse Guards Parade. So we come back I came back from the Gulf and just in time to take part in that. There was a dinner at the Mansion House in London where, as I've said to you, we get a lot of royals come in. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, was there and was the guest of honour. It was a very emotional moment, actually. It was quite a very special day, something that will remain with me for many years. Again, going through more operations, 2009, 2007, more deployments, exercises, even humanitarian assistance as well, which again was never heard of reservists getting involved with that. Okay. The operation in Libya was to get British citizens out of Libya during that conflict, and during the Olympics, the R&R provided an enormous amount of security staff during the Olympics program. They weren't very happy with the accommodation. Apparently, they were living in a warehouse. So, from the bridge, I'm bringing you right up to date now. This is one of my last COs. This is the new building.
Is there audio?
Again, we're moving on now. 2014, more relief efforts. Interesting, this Operation Kipion. During the time we had most problems with merchant ships being attacked by pirates, 75% of force protection SPO teams were naval reservists. So 75% of the people on the British merchant ships or whatever, the international merchant, I assume it was the British merchant ships only, but and we're working on the Royal Fleet auxiliaries and additional security staff on the warships. 75% of those were Royal Naval Reservists, and a large chunk of those came from London. Okay, continual exercises. It seems like same old really, but it is true. It's quite, from my point of view, it's been since the 80s when I first joined. The reserves have become far more embedded. In fact, one of the last things they did, we used to wear Royal Naval Reserve flashes on our shoulders, and the officers used to wear an R in the middle of their executive curl on their uniforms, but they were removed, so that there was actually very little discernible difference between the two. I'm not going to show this because time, and it does go on a little bit. It's an update. You know, if any of you is interested, if you go on YouTube and look for 26 update, these are things produced by the MOD that are continually churned out, and it's really like a news flash on there. And that is the end. By the way, I do think that is what they call it. It's not a real photograph. It's been artificially enhanced. And I only found out the other day that the Queen actually didn't have tea with Paddington. So, it's there you go. Anyway, I think that's the end from me. Have you any questions?